What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danielle Hallen and I am back with another true crime video. So today we're going to be speaking about the abduction and murder of 12-year-old Polly Klaas in California in 1993. This is a very well-known case, understandably, because it has forever changed the landscape for specifically missing children's cases, abductions, but in reality, it has changed the entire true crime landscape. This was the very first case to be publicly spread using the internet. At the time, the internet was in its little infancy stages, and so when this abduction and murder occurred, while it was in its infant stages, people kind of realized that it was a great tool to utilize in terms of spreading information as quickly as possible. Before this, people would really rely on mailing out posters to outlying cities and states and sometimes traveling that far to make sure to raise as much awareness as possible, as far and wide as possible. But that took a lot of time, and in these cases, time is of the essence, especially when you have something like a known abduction. And so the internet made it possible to pass along this information in just moments. So this case is where you see a huge turning point in using the internet to be able to raise awareness, and now look at where we are today. Not just that, out of this case came a very controversial law, and I'm interested to see what you guys think about this. It is the 3 strikes law, which I think, if I'm remembering correctly, is in 28 states still as of today. And there are a lot of people that are for the law, a lot of people that are against it. And this was kind of an interesting dynamic because in a lot of these cases that we have spoken about so far, the things that have come out of it have been overwhelmingly good. But with this, there was just a lot of questions about it. And there's a lot of people on the fence. Now I'll get deeper into this law towards the end of the video, but first let's go through what exactly happened in 1993 that started so much change. So Polly was born January 3rd, 1981, to parents Mark and Eve. They lived in Petaluma, California, and by the age of 2, her parents decided to get a divorce. Despite the challenging circumstances that typically come from being a child of divorce, Polly's parents made sure that they maintained a great relationship with her, an amicable relationship with each other to ensure that she had the best life, that their decision to separate did not end up ultimately affecting her in a negative way. And so her parents were both very active in her life. She spent a lot of time with both her mom and her dad. I do know that her mom did go on to eventually get married again and have more children. And according to her father, Mark, Polly was just this well-rounded, sweet young girl that would have grown up to be a beautiful, intelligent young woman. But unfortunately, that was completely stripped away from her. So Polly was very talented from a young age. She had a deep love for music. She played the piano, she played the clarinet. She took many years of music lessons in both of those, and her creativity also spread out to different areas. She loved theater, any sort of performing arts. She was incredibly dramatic, and that was one way that she could really flex that ability was through theater. And she also loved her friends, and her creative, silly side came out with them as well. Her father said that one of her favorite things to do was actually filming her and her friends. They'd pretend to have like a TV show or just something along those lines, and they'd film it and rewatch it. I honestly feel like she would have loved the age of YouTube. She was just a good student, a good daughter, and she was loved by so many. Now, on October 1st, 1993, Polly was staying at her mother's house in Petaluma, California, and she was planning on having the night of her life, like every single 12-year-old's dream. 2 of her best friends, Jillian and Kate, were going to be coming over that night. They were having a sleepover, and they had like the entire setup ready to go. Her room was ready. Her mom had bought ice cream for them. And with Halloween coming, she had a long list of plans. They were going to try on different costumes that night, plan out the best costume they could possibly have for Halloween. They also wanted to play some video games, and they had every intention of staying up all night long. The girls spent most of the night tucked away, giggling in Polly's room, and at around 9:45 p.m., her mom, Eve, came in to let the girls know that she was going to turn in early for the night. She had been battling with a migraine for most of the day. It just wouldn't let up, so she really needed to go to sleep. And she asked the girls to keep it down. However, she was also aware these are 12-year-old little girls that have all these crazy plans for the night, so staying quiet was probably not something that was going to last very long, if at all. So Eve went into her room that was just across the hallway from Polly's room, took some medication to help her sleep, and immediately fell asleep for the night. Until she was shaken awake at 11 p.m. that night, not even an hour and a half later. She was face to face when she was woken up with Jillian and Kate, and both of them were hysterical. Between their sobs and screams, they told Eve that Polly had been taken. She had been abducted by some big strange man with a beard right out of the safety of her own bedroom. And so right away, Petaluma police were called, and Jillian and Kate told a horrifying story of what had happened just moments after Eve fell asleep. The girls said that as soon as Eve turned in for the night, they continued on with their fun. They played a few more video games, and at around 10:30 p.m., they decided they wanted to go ahead and set up their sleeping bags for the night. And Polly was going to sleep in a sleeping bag as well on the floor with the girls, but her sleeping bag was in another room. So she opened the door with all intentions of getting her sleeping bag, but instead she came face to face with a very large, strange, bearded man staring back at her. The man immediately shoved the girls into the room, closed the door, and demanded that they get on the ground. According to both Jillian and Kate, they initially thought that this was some prank. After all, they were spending a lot of the night talking about Halloween and planning for Halloween, so maybe this was just some funny way of Polly to scare them. But when they realized that this man had a real knife and he had this absolutely crazed look in his eye, they knew that this was not some scheme by Polly, that this was very serious, and Polly looked absolutely horrified. He got them all on the ground and told each and every one of them that if they made a single noise to alert anyone else in the house, he was going to slit their throat. So they quietly laid on the floor and did exactly as he said, as he went around and one by one began to tie the girls up. Now, while he was tying the girls up, the one thing that gave them a shimmer of peace, like the tiniest bit of hope that they would be okay, was that the man repeatedly was saying he had no intentions of harming them and he only wanted money, which, I mean, is a little ironic given his previous statement, but this made them hopeful that they would be okay. He then went on to ask the girls just a whole string of questions, things like, who lives here? Do all of you live here? Which one? Obviously, he ended up finding out Polly was the only one of the three that resided in the home. He then started to ask who else lived in the house. Were they awake? What rooms were they in? And then he began to ask if there was money hidden anywhere. But very quickly, the hope that the girls originally had faded because Polly saw that as an opportunity of, hey, he wants money. If I tell this man where the money is, he will leave us. So she directed him to where there was a jewelry box that had some cash in it, but he seemed totally uninterested. So at this point, they knew that he was likely there for something else. Once all of the girls had been tied up, he then got 2 different pillowcases. I believe he just pulled them off of the pillows that were at the house, and he put them over Jillian and Kate's head, and then he instructed them to count to 1,000. He said that he was going to be taking Polly, but reassured the girls that once they got to 1,000, Polly would be back and he would be gone. But in their guts, they knew that that was likely not going to happen. And so off this strange man went, taking their best friend with them, and they decided, screw counting to 1,000. The second things get quiet, we're going for help. So once the house completely fell silent, both of the girls immediately started working on freeing themselves. They were tied, they had pillowcases over their head. I cannot imagine the level of fear that they were experiencing in this moment, and it took them about 20 minutes, but they did manage to set themselves free and immediately ran to Eve, and the nightmare of the abduction of Polly Klaas began. Police arrived at the Petaluma home at around 11:30 p.m. that night, and around the same time, Mark Klaas was also called and told that his daughter had been abducted. Now, from interviews with Mark, which I do have linked down below, I believe it was Eve's ex-husband, the one that she married after Mark, that ended up calling him because Polly's half-sister had been at the house at the time. She was safe and fine. She was in her own room and not a part of the situation, thankfully. But he ended up calling Mark and letting him know because Eve was just an absolute shambles. And he was instructed, Mark was, to not come to the house. They didn't want to add any more people in and out of the home, potentially messing with evidence. And emotions are high when it comes to parents coming into these types of situations. And obviously, you're going to throw caution to the wind. And when you're in a state of panic and distress, and that was just not something that would have been beneficial to the case. So he was kind of at a point where he was told to basically sit and wait. Now, he did use this time to call the FBI. He said that, ironically, he remembered the Lindbergh baby case, which I just covered in the previous video, where the FBI was called in to help, and he felt that was the best thing he could possibly do while sitting and waiting. And sure enough, the FBI did end up coming, and they arrived around midnight. It was pretty clear from the get-go that this was likely a stranger abduction. Jillian and Kate did not recognize this man at all. Based on the questions that he was asking, he didn't seem familiar with this family dynamic at all. He didn't know who lived in the house. And so that meant that this was one of the most dangerous and scary types of abductions. Stranger abductions are not common. When there is a child specifically that is abducted, it is way more likely that it is usually one of the parents, or it's at least a family member, or someone that knows the child, a teacher. You know, it's not usually a complete stranger. And according to the FBI files, which is a page on YouTube where you can watch them speak about this case, they went by the rule of thirds when it comes to stranger abductions. I don't know how true the rule of thirds rings today, but back then, usually with stranger abductions, a third of them are located and brought home safe, another third of them are found deceased, and the last third are never found at all. So statistically, things were not looking good. But as the investigation in the quiet neighborhood of Petaluma is beginning, something else is happening 30 miles away that wasn't connected to this case for 2 months. A woman named Dana Jaffe had called into Santa Rosa Police Department to report a strange man on her property. So according to Dana, she lived off of Pythian Road, which appears from Google Maps to be just a dead-end road into some national park or forestry service area, something along those lines, and she lived on a good plot of land. And that night, it was around 11:30, I believe, when her babysitter, who had been at the house that night, was heading down the long driveway trying to go home for the night, when suddenly a large bearded man appeared in her headlights. He was standing in the middle of the driveway, flagging her down. He was beside a car that was very obviously stuck in a ditch, and this was a private driveway, so it was already very odd for the man to be down this driveway to begin with, but it was his behavior that was the largest red flag for this babysitter and Dana Jaffe. The man very aggressively, not asked, but demanded the babysitter to get out of her car and help him. He wanted to get his car out of the ditch. He was instructing her, stop your car, get out right now, help me get out. He was agitated, very pushy. He was also demanding to know what was up the driveway, which really worried this babysitter because what was up the driveway was Dana and her daughter. And according to this babysitter, this man looked like a, quote, madman. So worried for her safety and also worried about Dana and her daughter, she refused to get out of her car to help this guy and booked it down the driveway to get to her house as soon as possible to call Dana and warn her about what was going on just a few yards away from her own home. Now, Dana was just this absolute boss of a woman, and she put her daughter in the car, grabbed a gun, and drove down her driveway to try to figure out what was going on. And when she got to the location where the man was, he was no longer there. The car was still there. He was nowhere to be found. She continued down the rest of the length of the driveway. He still was nowhere to be found. And so she decided to head into town where it was going to be safe for her and her daughter and call into police to have them go and check it out and hopefully escort this man off of her property. But Dana made it very clear when she spoke to police that she did not want to press charges on this man for trespassing onto personal property. She probably thought, I already have more trouble than I want. I don't want to prolong this. I don't want to press charges. I just want him gone. So police arrived just minutes after midnight to locate this man, and they found him standing beside this car stuck in the ditch. When they approached him, again, red flags just all over the place. This man was profusely sweating. He was covered in dirt with like leaves sticking up out of his hair. So this description of madman was spot on so far. It looked like he had just been rolling all over the ground. He was still incredibly agitated and pacing around. He smelled of alcohol, and police even saw beer cans in the back of his car, so that could potentially explain some of his behavior. And so they started to figure out what on earth this man was doing on Dana's property. And the story that he gave was less than believable. So this man said that he had been out sightseeing in the dark at like 11:30 p.m. because that makes perfect sense. Casual thing that we all do. And he ended up accidentally going down this private driveway, which, looking at Google Maps, I can kind of see that that'd be a possibility. But he said that when he went down this driveway and realized it was a private driveway, he decided to turn around. And upon doing so, he got stuck in this ditch. So that explains that portion of the story. Now, to explain his appearance and being covered in dirt and leaves, he said that he had been underneath his car. He crawled under there to try to get his car out of the ditch, and that is why he looked the way that he did. But police were not buying this, and they called him out on all of his BS. They pointed out how odd it was for him to claim that he was sightseeing at that time of night. They also pointed out that his car was positioned a certain way in the ditch to where this big burly man could not have fit underneath of it. It was physically impossible for him to have done that. And then obviously they're pointing out the beer cans in his car. They're like, none of this adds up. It seems like you may have bad intentions. This man just became more aggravated as police called him out. And I guess in an act of defiance or something, he decided to crack open a beer that they had just called him out on and start chugging it right then and there. Obviously, they took it and made him pour it out. And so they decided at this point they were going to administer a few sobriety tests because they felt like something was off with this guy, but they just couldn't figure out what exactly it was. So somehow he ended up passing all of the sobriety tests. And so in another attempt to get this man either into custody or something to figure out what was going on, they decided to pull up his plates, see if there was anything they could bring him in on in terms of his driving record. And unfortunately, it ended up being clean. But they did find out that the man that they were speaking to was a man named Richard Davis. Now, I do want to state very quickly that at the time when you pulled up someone's license plate, it did not pull up a lot of information about that individual, basically just like the name, address they lived at, ownership of the vehicle, and then their driving history. So it didn't pull up a full criminal history. Had it, however, things might have happened way differently, and honestly, this entire story would probably be very different. So after questioning this strange man for 45 minutes and trying to find some reason to bring him in because of how odd his story was and how he was acting, they unfortunately realized they had absolutely no reason to detain him any longer. So they had no choice but to simply pull his car out of this ditch and escort him off the property. That was the best that they could do. So they did escort him to the nearby highway, and once they were satisfied that he was far enough away, they drove off for the night. Little did these officers know that this man had just totally bamboozled them. Meanwhile, back at Polly's house, the investigation was pushing on. A forensic search of the room unfortunately just didn't seem to be offering up a whole lot of evidence. They did find a handful of fingerprints throughout the room and the home, but all of them were just matching back to the families. They did find that a Nintendo cord and the strap to a purse in Polly's room had been cut up and used to tie the girls up, but again, those had all been in the room at the time. There was really no sign of a weapon left behind or other physical evidence. They were not working with a lot. The only thing that they initially found were these long strips of silky fabric that didn't appear to be from the home, but they had been used to bind up the girls as well. So this did bring in this element that this was at the very least partially planned. Someone had brought something with them or used something on them to rip up into bindings. Whether Polly was specifically targeted or not at this point was still still unknown, but they at least felt that someone put some level of thought and planning into this. By the following morning, evidence was being sent off to forensic labs, and the FBI decided to bring in their own advanced evidence teams to try to go over the room one more time, hoping to find some sort of evidence, something that may have been missed in the room. Meanwhile, there was also canvassing that was being done in the neighborhood. They were trying to figure out if anyone had seen anything at all strange that night, and this actually ended up bringing forward a lot of information. So a good handful of people actually saw this strange man at Polly's house that night. And I'm not just talking about one or two, it was a good amount of people. And the time frames that they gave seeing this man show that this man had actually been lurking in the darkness around Polly's home for hours before he eventually jumped into action and went into the home and abducted her. One young man in the neighborhood was walking with friends that night to a nearby movie store, and it was around 9 p.m. And this young man had lived in the neighborhood for a while. He knew pretty much everyone that lived there, and he noticed someone that he didn't recognize standing kind of in the shadows beside Polly's house. It was enough to alert him, and it was enough for him to do a good once-over to be like, you know what, I don't know who that man is, but he still went on his way. And apparently on his way back, he looked again and the man was still there. Another young man that lived behind Polly's home, I think he rented like a townhouse that was there. He was playing video games with some friends when he looked out of the window at around 10:30 p.m. and noticed a strange man standing on Polly's back doorstep. For some reason, despite these two individuals plus a handful of others that saw this strange man lurking around Polly's home, no one decided to call the police and warn them about it. So all of the descriptions of this strange man were the same: a big burly man with a large beard. Jillian and Kate also sat down right away with a sketch artist to create a drawing of this man that they saw that night. And the police decided the first place that they really wanted to start, apart from canvassing the neighborhood, was with sex offenders throughout the area. They did go and question all of Polly's family and her friends and her father to rule all of them out right away. And it basically just confirmed them even more that this was a stranger abduction. So this was like finding a needle in a haystack. Over the next 2 months, over 4,000 volunteers dedicated their time to finding Polly. Thousands of posters were printed out right away to be handed at stores around town, hung up at every gas station, at every street corner. I believe in that very first weekend alone of her abduction, over 50,000 different posters were handed out. That is a huge amount. Ground searches were done not just by the FBI, but again with volunteers. It seemed that the local police department and FBI were working very closely hand in hand with all of these volunteers to try to get out and search as much as humanly possible. It was like all hands on deck. Every effort was exhausted. The command center that was started right away as well to kind of create this hub for the volunteers to become more organized, to be able to field calls from people, just really sit down and plan and make sure that they're doing things the best of their abilities. And the FBI also helped exhaust every option they possibly had to search. In these 2 months, they ran down 60,000 leads. That is so much to do, and something that hit me really hard listening to the FBI speak about that. And I mean, it's something that's obvious, but it's not something I feel like we really think about or speak about a lot. 60,000 leads, and the FBI agent speaking about it was like, you don't have any choice. As dumb or as silly as some of the leads might be, you can't afford to not look into each and every one of them because you just never know which one is going to be the one. And to think about officers just day in, day out, 60,000 times looking into possible answers and every time hitting a dead end. I feel like that just really goes to show the level of effort that is put in by authorities to help locate missing persons, abducted persons. It's a lot of work, and I'm sure it can be very easy to feel incredibly defeated when you just hit dead end and brick wall after dead end and brick wall, but you have no choice but to keep on going for the sake of who you are looking for. Helicopters were brought in to search. 3,000 miles were searched by air. 1,000 miles were covered on ground between volunteers, local police, and FBI. They questioned all sex offenders, and each one again hit them on a dead wall. They spoke to Polly's teachers. They spoke to her classmates, just trying to find any sort of connection, and there was just nothing. As I also stated, they realized realized it's time to utilize the internet. So they got Polly's poster on the internet so that anyone from any country, anywhere could download her poster, print it out, and pass it along as far and wide as they can. And Winona Ryder also ended up stepping forward during all of this to offer a $200,000 reward. She was from Petaluma herself, and she spoke about how deeply this case affected her. And so she wanted to be able to do what she could to put more eyes on this case and encourage the right people to come forward. However, there was more evidence that ended up being found that helped a lot in this case. As I stated, the FBI brought in their own evidence team, and they also brought in very specialized equipment that local authorities just didn't have access to, and they were hoping this could help fill in some gaps. And sure enough, they found a lot that the police didn't. I think they found over 4 dozen fingerprints in the room that the police and their technology they had at the time was not able to uncover. Granted, all of those fingerprints still ended up just being those from the family, but they did end up finding one print that was not from the family. It was a very large palm print that had been placed on Polly's bed frame. And from the way it was placed, it seemed like maybe the individual who they believed was the intruder, the abductor, had put his hand up on the bed to lean over and pick something up, or to secure something, maybe to grab the pillow off the bed for the pillowcases. So this would more so be something they could compare to a potential suspect than anything else, but that's still better than having nothing. They also decided to take a much closer look at the rug that was in the room at the time, and they were able to pull a few fibers and also a hair. So all of this evidence was sent to the same lab in Washington that the other evidence was at, and it was looked over. Now, the long strands of fabric that had been found right off the bat by the initial investigation and forensic search of the room, they found that this was silky fabric. It was all from likely one piece of fabric, such as a woman's slip, possibly a woman's nightgown, and this had been used to tie the girls up. Again, it was not from the room, and it gave a bit more insight and support into the idea that this crime had intention behind it. These long strips had not been haphazardly ripped in the spur of the moment. It wasn't pulled off as a garment from whoever abducted these girls and used just in a moment of need. This had been purposefully cut into these long strips with a pair of scissors. So again, planning and premeditation. The fibers that had been found on the rug were also believed to have come from the carpet of a vehicle to make sure that this wasn't just from Polly getting in and out of her parents' cars or something and walking around her room. They did try to match the fibers to fibers from the cars that were at the home, and it wasn't a match. So again, it was believed that this likely was from the perpetrator. The hair that was found on the carpet also was looked into, and they were able to determine that this had been forcefully pulled out. So typically, if a hair just falls out of your head, there's no bits of like the follicle or the root of the hair still left on it. But when a hair is forcefully pulled out, if you've like plucked your eyebrows before or something like that, and on the very end of the hair, there's like this whitish tip to it, that actually contains things like DNA and shows that it had been forcibly removed, and that was still on the hair. Not only did they now have potential DNA evidence of the perpetrator, but they also had evidence that Polly may have fought back against her attacker at some point. And while all this evidence didn't immediately lead them to the abductor, they at least now had more than they had started off with. By mid-October, Jillian and Kate were brought in again. At this point, things had settled down, and they wanted to get a more accurate sketch of the man that these girls saw that night, and they knew that when they initially had asked the girls to do the sketch, they had just come off fresh from this traumatic event. And so they wanted the girls to have a little bit more time to think, be a little more clear-headed, and so they created a second sketch, and this sketch replaced the first one and circulated far and wide. But still, after thousands of leads, after a second sketch, after more evidence being collected, they were no closer to answers. And the family during this time was just tossed around emotionally from being thrust into the spotlight in a way that they had hoped they never would through a tragic event. They were unfortunately also taken advantage of by people in the community. There was one little girl in the community that was encouraged by her friends at school to call into Mark and pretend to be Polly. And unfortunately, this not only put him into a lot of emotional distress because he felt his daughter was out there somewhere. This girl claimed to be in a hotel. She was trying to get away from her captor. But this also had police putting a lot of effort into tracing this phone call, a lot of man hours into sitting and waiting for another call to come in. And unfortunately, it ended up being one huge prank. On top of that, after this $200,000 reward was put out there by Winona Ryder, this 20-year-old kid decided to call in, pretend to be Polly's abductor, and demand a $10,000 ransom from the family. So again, we're kind of seeing this drawback and emotional toll that the process of raising awareness takes, which is unfortunately a necessary evil that helps bring answers, but it absolutely exhausts those involved and furthers the trauma that they are experiencing. But then answers ended up coming from a very unexpected place. And so now we're going back to Dana Jaffe and that originally thought to be completely unrelated event 30 miles away from the home that happened the exact same night the abductor took Polly. So on November 29th, almost 2 months exactly from the abduction, Dana Jaffe called into police for a second time. She said that she had been walking her property, something that she liked to occasionally do to inspect it, make sure fences were good, and there's no trash or anything crazy going on. And she found some very strange items of concern given the abducted young girl that had been plastered all over the news. When police officers arrived on Pythian Road to take a look at what Dana was talking about, she led them through a thick patch of woods right beside her driveway into a small clearing. And in this small clearing was a collection of very odd items. There was clothing that had obviously belonged to a young girl, matching the age of Polly. There were rolls of tape. There was, I believe, one unrolled condom and one condom still in the packaging. And there was a pair of girls' tights that had been tied in the knot. And entangled in the knot were long strands of hair, matching the color and texture of Polly's. Dana told the officer that she had not really connected the two until this moment, but on the night Polly had gone missing, around the time Petaluma police had arrived at Polly's home to check into her abduction, Santa Rosa police had been responding to her call about this suspicious man, and that everyone thought something strange was going on with this man, but they just couldn't put their finger on it. So this officer decided to check into the situation, check into the man that was caught on Dana's property. Upon doing this, went a step further than the police were able to do at the time, and looked into this man's criminal record, the record of Richard Davis. The results put a pit in all of their stomachs. Richard Davis had a very, very long criminal history. He started committing crimes when he was a young teenager, usually small things like petty theft or assault, burglary. But unfortunately, the most alarming was that he also had a history of kidnapping, and not just once. In 1976, Richard Davis had attempted to push a woman into his car. Thankfully, she was able to break free from his grasp and run away as fast as she could, and reported him and this attempted abduction. He ended up being captured and was sent to a psychiatric clinic for evaluation to see why on earth he had thought it was acceptable to do this. He also had some other questionable things throughout his history, and they really were worried about his state of mental health. But somehow, while in this psychiatric clinic, he managed to escape. And instead of escaping and running far off and staying quiet for a while, which you would expect most people to do, the first thing he did was break into the home of a couple and tie them up to hold them hostage. And yet again, he was captured for this, and this time he was sentenced to 16 years in prison for his crimes. I believe in total, throughout his entire life, he should have been in prison for up to 200 years. He should not have been out wandering the streets, but somehow every single time he managed to get out in a fraction of the time that he had been sentenced. For example, his most recent sentence of 16 years in prison, he only ended up serving 8 of those years. Between the history and the close proximity to the crime, they decided this was a good potential match for whoever may have abducted Polly. And when his photo was compared to the sketch that the girls had helped create, it seemed like they had their guy. And this was incredibly frustrating because that means that within within 30 minutes to an hour of the crime, this man was face to face with authorities. But at the time, these police officers never could have known. There, I guess, hadn't really been any announcement yet. I think there had been one frequency on police radios where Petaluma police had kind of put something out about this abduction, but they didn't have a good identification of the man yet. They didn't have a lot of details, and from my understanding, these police officers in Santa Rosa were not on the same frequency. And while they definitely felt like something was off about this guy, when police went to check into him being stuck in this ditch in Santa Rosa off of Pythian Road, there was no sign of Polly. She was nowhere to be found. So this kind of raised all these questions of, what was he doing on this back end road? Was he actually trying to dispose of her? If this is our guy, is she possibly buried somewhere around here? So obviously, they immediately started ground searches in this area to try to see if there was a shallow grave somewhere or possibly any other evidence that led them to answers about Polly. They also really wanted to speak to Richard Davis, but obviously speaking to him about his potential involvement in an abduction and murder was not going to be easy. This man probably did not want to go back to prison. They had to figure out some other way to get him. Meanwhile, the ground searches around Pythian Road continued, and all of the evidence that they did find and were able to collect was sent off to Washington. At the clearing on Pythian, not only had there been all of these young girls' clothing and the condoms, there was also tape and lighters, but there was one piece of evidence that was pretty damning, and it was some long strips of silky fabric. The same kind of long strips of silky fabric found in Polly's room that night. When the lab went to look at all of these pieces together, it fit like a puzzle. They knew that they had to bring Richard Davis in as soon as possible, and they ended up finding a way to do it. Not only had he been face to face with police officers immediately after abducting Polly, but he also had been pulled over on a DUI shortly after that. Now, this was a probation violation. He had been released after 8 years instead of 16, but he was on probation as a way to kind of extend that sentencing. And he should have been in a lot of trouble. A DUI while on probation is a pretty large deal that usually will throw you at least back in jail for a while. But somehow, he only ended up being in jail for one night. So Richard Davis, yet again, gets another simple slap on the wrist. But at this point, authorities had to work this to their benefit. They could still bring him in because of this probation violation, and while he was in jail, they could question him about the abduction. So on November 30th, Richard Davis was found and arrested. When they started to question him about Polly Klaas and her abduction, he originally denied having any sort of knowledge of the abduction or anything to do with it. But police were already beginning to compare evidence and build a case against him, and all of this evidence that they had suggested otherwise. They had been able to take a palm print from him when he was brought into jail for this probation violation, and it perfectly matched the print found in the room. As I stated, the strips of fabric that were found near this incident on Pythian Road also had been matched to those in Polly's room. All of the evidence that they had found went directly back to Richard Davis. The information about all of this was released to the press almost immediately. They had full intentions of arresting him. They felt they had enough at this point, but Richard didn't know that they had all of this. And so when this was released to the public, his friends and family ended up seeing it before him. And one of his friends decided to go and meet with him in jail to put forward this information and encourage him to come forward and tell the truth. And when his friend first arrived, he continued to deny having anything to do with it. But once a paper with all of the news was slapped in his face, he kind of sunk and said, all right, I'm going to call the police. So within, I think, 2 to 4 days of being arrested, Richard Davis called the investigators and said that he wanted to confess. Now, many things about his confession, I will say, just don't add up. So there are still a lot of questions that feel like they are unanswered to this day. And it seems he was telling the truth, but also trying to kind of protect himself at the same time. But regardless, there was still enough information there for them to find out where Polly was buried and get an idea of what exactly had happened that night. So Richard told police that at the time of the abduction, he had just been released from prison and he was in a halfway house nearby. In the night of October 1st, he had put in a request to leave the halfway house for the night to go to Petaluma where his mother lived because he wanted to go and visit her. His real intentions were he wanted to go and get money from his mom. According to what he said, this request was accepted, and so off he went to Petaluma that night, but this is where things get a little bit questionable. Richard claims that he couldn't find his mom's house. And so instead, he decided to enjoy this night that he had away from the halfway house and wander around the city of Petaluma. He claims that he decided to take a random joint from a stranger, that he smoked, had a couple beers, and quickly realized that his joint had been laced with what he believed was LSD. So he is absolutely tripping out of his mind, and he says he remembers somehow ending up in a Petaluma neighborhood. He vividly remembers crawling into some stranger's window, and conveniently from that point on, he blacks out. He claims that once he came to, it was a while later, and he was driving in his car with some young little girl in the passenger seat that he didn't know. Richard claimed that at this point he had no idea what he had done, but he had obviously done something bad, and so he needed to figure out how to move from there, how to deal with the situation. So that's when he decided to drive around for a little bit, and ultimately he ended up on a private driveway, the driveway of Dana Jaffe. And when he realized that he was stuck in this driveway, he had a moment of panic because he knew someone would eventually stumble upon him or he would need to call for help. But he has this 12-year-old little girl in his car who could easily say, hey, this crazy man abducted me. And so he claimed that he picked her up and walked her like deep into the woods right off the driveway. Obviously, her mouth was likely taped. Given the other bits of evidence that were found at the scene, there was like this silk bag that had been like fashioned into a sack that probably had been put over her head. And then he went to try to free his car. So that could explain why Polly wasn't with him when the police had arrived that night. So apparently when he was escorted back to the highway by police, that entire time, Polly had just been out in the middle of the woods in the absolute darkness. And after the police had left him, he waited 15 to 30 minutes, what he felt was safe, to go back and pick Polly up. From there, he told police that he drove to Cloverfield, California, and that is where he made the decision that he had no choice but to kill her. He said that she would identify him, that he did not want to go back to prison, so he strangled her and then hid her in a field beside an abandoned wood mill, and he buried her in a shallow grave and covered her with planks of wood. And this entire time, he tried to tell police that none of this was intentional, that he had plans to just visit his mom, and it was the LSD that made him do something that he wouldn't normally do. However, that is the biggest crock of crap, in my opinion. He had multiple times before tried to abduct someone. On top of that, they had way too much evidence suggesting that this was something that was planned out. I don't for a minute buy that he conveniently just didn't know where his mom lived and couldn't find her house. I think that he fully intended that night to go out and abduct someone, which is evident by the pieces of long fabric that he brought with him. He apparently had brought tape, fabric, all these things that he would need in a duffel bag with him that night, which again shows premeditation. And while Polly may have ended up being a random target in his drunken and drugged stupor, I think his intentions were all the same. Immediately after giving police this statement of what had happened that night, they wanted him to lead them to Polly. They wanted to be able to recover Polly's body, to be able to return her to her family so they could lay her to rest. They didn't even want to wait until the next day. It was like late at night when they had finally finished this conversation with Richard, and so they all headed out in the middle of the night to this abandoned wood mill, to this empty field, and there they ended up finding the remains of Polly Klaas. Now, right away, he was arrested for murder and put in jail. The medical examiner began an autopsy just to confirm parts of the story and to see what really had happened. Now, the medical examiner was able to determine that Polly's cause of death was in fact strangulation, which matches what Richard said, but unfortunately her body was so decomposed that that's pretty much all they were able to find out. Because of the condoms and other things that were found at the scene of the crime, the way that her body and clothing was found in the middle of the field, there were very high suspicions that she had also been sexually assaulted. And so they wanted to be able to lay more charges on him him if that's what happened, because that's what he deserved. But unfortunately, they ended up having no way to prove this. Just the decomposition was too much, and Richard would not admit to sexually assaulting her. He has steadily denied doing that. The loss of Polly was a massive one. The community far and wide, not just Petaluma, was hurting. Parents were scared for their children, understandably, questioning the safety of their own home. And how on earth did this man, a known repeat offender, a violent offender at that, how was he repeatedly released from prison to just recommit these same crimes and harm people over and over? Everyone was scared. Everyone was worried. What's going on with the justice system? What's going on in our safe neighborhoods? And while everyone awaited his trial, a movement began. So a family had already started pushing for something known as a 3-strike law. Their daughter had been taken from them by repeat offenders. And Polly's family decided to hop in on this and push for the same law, because this 3 strikes law could have saved their daughter had it been around when they needed it. If Richard had been serving his full sentence, at the very least, of 16 years, he would not have been out of prison to be able to harm Polly the night of October the 1st. The 3 strikes law would essentially make it so that anyone with 3 felony convictions would receive a mandatory 25-year to life sentence for their next charge. This 3 strikes law, which was incredibly harsh, would be there to hopefully keep repeat offenders behind bars and off of the streets so they could not continue the pattern that they'd already proven they were following. Now, the support for this law had a massive backing behind it. A lot of people believe that these repeat offenders should not have an opportunity to get out of prison. They should remain where they are, not be given the chance to continuously harm people, which for violent offenders is understandable. But at the same time, this was also kind of debated a lot. There were some people that did not believe that was a fair punishment, that it did not support any type of, I guess, chance for rehabilitation. And so because of this debate, it unfortunately was turned into a gigantic political tool, which just totally crumbled away at anything good that could have come from this, basically. So Republicans were calling Democrats soft for not being in huge support of this law, or the death penalty, which was a huge topic of conversation in California at the time, while the Democrats were calling Republicans murderers, and people were using this in their campaigns to try to pin one against the other because it was the up-and-coming hot topic at the time. And this ended up influencing a lot of people's decisions and thoughts when it came to this law. And ultimately, in 1994, the law was in fact enacted in the state of California. Now, while this did seem like a huge one at first, because again, there was a gigantic positive backing for this law, it all very quickly came crashing down. Now, many states had followed in California's footsteps and started to create a 3 strikes law of their own, but California in particular, it just seemed like they didn't have any limits with it. Even if the third offense was something as small as petty theft, the person was going to be thrown in prison for life for that. So there was no line at all in the sand where basically violent offenders were the only ones that were under this law. So these non-violent individuals doing things that were not necessarily causing harm to anyone, that there could be this possibility for rehabilitation, they were being roped in. I think there was someone who was thrown in prison for life after taking a kid's slice of pizza. There was someone that stole a pair of socks that was thrown in prison for life. I mean, just things that are absolutely absurd, and just the punishment does not match the crime. And so a lot of people finally were kind of waking up, and they were like, wait a minute, this probably was not very well thought out. So many people, including Mark Klaas, that had once fully supported this law, began to advocate for a reform. They still wanted the 3 strikes law to be in place because for violent offenders, it was something that could potentially save hundreds, if not thousands of lives in the state of California. But these people that were having their entire lives stripped away over these small crimes not worthy of a life sentence, it was just completely unacceptable. But because it had been used as this political tool, no one wanted to touch it. The same people that put this into law now wanted to forget about it. They wanted to wash their hands of it. No one wanted to be labeled as a murderer or as soft. And that was immediately what was going to end up happening if someone tried to change it. Meanwhile, Richard went to trial, and he knew pretty much from the get-go that there was no getting out of this. he did in fact confess. All of the evidence tied him to the crime. So I don't even think there was a lot that could be brought forward from the defense's side to try to fight this. So on June 18th, 1996, he was found guilty of murder. And it kind of sucks because I was hoping with the confession that there would be some sort of remorse or apology, but that's just me apparently giving everyone possible the benefit of the doubt, because there was no remorse from Richard Davis. There was no apology. In fact, when he was read the guilty verdict, his first thing that he did was turn to the cameras that everyone around the world was watching and put up both of his middle fingers. So clearly he did not care about what he did. On September 27th, when he went to his sentencing, he still showed absolutely no change of heart. There was still no remorse. There was still no guilt. And when his death sentence was read aloud, he became infuriated. He actually stood up and started screaming at Mark Klaas, at Polly's father. He was threatening him and cursing at him and throwing out these baseless accusations, basically to try to divert all this attention from himself. And unfortunately just taking another shot at the family after what he had already put them through. So while the Klaas family did get justice for their daughter and they did have a chance to lay her to rest, they would never get to see her live out her life. And the man that did this to her didn't even have the decency to at least shut his mouth. They had lost their daughter. She would never be able to continue to make silly videos or play music or be in another play or graduate or grow or have a family. They had lost something that meant so much to them. And on top of that, this law that they had hoped would be beneficial, that they had pushed for because of her death, was now creating a lot of chaos and had been used as this negative tool politically. And so they knew that their fight was not over. They continued to fight at this point, not just for Polly, but for other victims of crime. Mark became one of the most well-known advocates for victims of true crime. The Polly Klaas Foundation is probably one of the most important foundations that I will ever speak of on this channel. They do so much incredible work, and there's so many great ways for you to be able to help. And so I'm hoping, usually I can start fundraisers down below. I have done it already for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children on another video, but YouTube has to be able to recognize them as a nonprofit, which I obviously think that the Polly Klaas should be there. So if they are, I have not been able to check. There will be a way that we can fundraise for this cause down below. I will make a donation. I encourage you guys to as well if you're able. But basically, the Polly Klaas Foundation that was started in 1993 is a national nonprofit that basically helps in the recovery of missing children as well as preventative safety for all children. They work on a lot of education. Over 10,000 families have been helped by the foundation, with more being added to that every single day since they were created in 93. They're actually in the works of creating a community theater at the moment. I don't know when exactly it's going to be open. They may have even already opened it. I know that their page online just says coming soon, but it's basically a tribute to Polly and her love for acting. It helps to give children in the community a safe and creative space to spend time. You can donate directly to help their project, and if you are nearby, you can go and see some of these plays once the theater opens. You can also just donate to the foundation in general, and there's so many different ways to do it, which I thought was really cool, because I know that there can be specific things that you really hope your money goes towards. So the way that they have it set up, you can choose just that, where your donation goes to. So you can donate to posters for missing children to be printed off, donate specifically to their 24-hour hotline, to their rapid response team, to case management, which if a family contacts them, they have different case managers that they can assign to these families, so you can help cover that cost. Social media, safety education, all of these different ways, so you know that the money that you are giving is directly going to help a family in need right this moment. It's honestly incredible. You can also just choose to spread your donation across all of those different things, and you can also choose to donate monthly. The difference that you can make through this organization is absolutely massive, and probably my favorite thing about this organization is that all of you can help in some way, shape, or form. I feel like a lot of the different organizations that I speak of, they're so like location specific. And so you have to be in California to utilize them, or New York, or even just a specific city. But because this organization is national, if you are in the US, you can help. You can still donate even if you're not in the US. But they have a rapid response team, you guys, and I signed up for it myself. So I really encourage you guys to do the same. Basically, you fill out a quick questionnaire and you can join as a volunteer to help distribute missing children's posters in your community. So 5 times a month, you will receive an email, roughly can fluctuate a little bit, with a missing children's poster attached to it. And you can print out as many as you like and go out into your community and pass out these flyers, post them up wherever you can. They encourage you to do it as a family or an organization. I just think it's absolutely awesome. And I think that everyone should definitely take the time to be a part of it, whatever way you can. Polly Klaas is also a really great organization to recommend. If you see people on TikTok suddenly posting about their missing child, or Facebook or anywhere, tell them to go to the Polly Klaas website, because they offer a lot of support for families with missing children. They will help get you in touch with a caseworker. They will help print out a first set of flyers for you. They will help you reach out to the media. They will help you reach out to your police department. There is no guideline for when you have a missing child and your brain is all over the place and you're scared and you're overwhelmed. And so to have an organization like this to help provide you with so many different resources and a helping hand to guide you, honestly, there is nothing better at a time of need. Now back to the 3 strikes law. As of 2021, I do believe 28 states still have the 3 strikes law, but there is a stipulation in all of those states, I'm pretty sure, that makes it to where only violent repeat offenders fall under it. And unfortunately, it took until 2012 for California to revise theirs, which means decades of people were thrown in prison for life for, reasons that did not deserve it. I will say, however, that California did, when they revised this law, state that if someone was incarcerated under it wrongfully, they didn't use that word, I'm using that word, that they could apply for resentencing. So thankfully, a lot of people were able to have those sentences changed, but they also didn't guarantee the resentencing. So there's that. But shortly after this happened, I believe it was like 2018, I want to say, there was the moratorium that was put in place when it came to the death sentence. And there are a handful of interviews where Mark has expressed his anger about this, because Richard Davis is still sitting on death row. He was found guilty and sentenced in 96, and he is still sitting on death row in California as of this day. And when the moratorium was put in place, Mark spoke about how unfair he felt that was, and the fact that this man that murdered his daughter might possibly outlive him. Now, I know everyone has their different feelings about the death penalty in general, so who knows what on earth will happen with that. Now, one other very interesting thing that has come out of this case that I highly encourage you guys to check out is that Polly's sisters, who had remained completely silent all of this time, finally came out in 2021, and they announced that they were going to be creating a podcast. They were both incredibly young when this happened, when Polly was taken from them, and obviously struggled with the aftermath. That's a lot of trauma. They, as children, were thrust into the spotlight as well. They had to hear and see things that they never should have had to hear and see. And so this is really the first time that they have felt comfortable coming forward to express themselves and give insights into their thoughts. So they created this new podcast called A New Legacy, and they speak to experts and survivors of true crime, which is incredibly awesome, and basically speak to them about how true crime has impacted their lives. So you really get a firsthand look into what these families go through, the experiences that they have, how that may differ, and it might help you as a true crime consumer kind of make better decisions about the content you consume and the things that you say, and the ways in which you can help without possibly further harming the family. Ethics in true crime is a huge conversation right now. I know that I still have so much to learn and always want to encourage you guys to continue learning as well. They also, in their podcast, speak about how to ensure safer communities, and also they've made it very clear that they are not a big fan of the 3 strikes law, kind of the guilt that has followed them, because they are tied to that law. And all of these people that were sentenced to life in prison because of that law, they speak a lot on mass incarceration, which is a massive problem in this country, and their thoughts on using preventative systems instead of punishment. Now, I personally haven't had a chance to really give a lot of the different episodes a listen, but the work they're doing seems to be shedding a lot of necessary light on solving root problems. I've talked about this before, and I feel like it's not spoken about enough, that we put a lot of effort into dealing with the end result of these crimes and how to clean up afterwards and how to deal with the individuals afterwards. And that's why I focus so much on psychology. And I know a lot of people don't want, true crime creators and other people to speak a lot about the perpetrators themselves. And I know a lot of people don't agree with speaking about serial killers, but I feel like understanding the psychology of these people and how they ended up getting in a position where they could do so much harm to someone is incredibly important when it comes to understanding how to hopefully prevent that problem. So obviously that's right up my alley, and I'm definitely going to be checking out that podcast. All in all, a little girl's life was lost, but thankfully there has been a lot of positive change since then. I mean, being the very first case where the internet helps raise awareness, it's crazy to see that I can now sit here on YouTube and speak about these cases in depth and get as much information out there as possible, just to see how much it's changed, and now the power that utilizing the internet and the media really holds to help solve these cases. It started an entire movement that has just grown and grown and grown since then. On top of that, seeing something like the Polly Klaas Foundation come out of this and how many families they've been able to help and how they are able to mobilize an entire nation is really awesome. So again, I encourage you guys to go and check that out. That is all that I have for you guys today. I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Polly's story, and hopefully you walked away from this learning something, or maybe getting a new perspective that you didn't have before. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Howlin' fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.